Steve Harvey had experienced poverty firsthand during his early years as a struggling comedian, living in his car for 3 years in the late 1980s while pursuing his dream of making people laugh for a living. Those memories of sleeping in a 1976 Ford Tempo, washing up in gas station bathrooms, and wondering where his next meal would come from had never fully left him despite the decades of success that followed. But on a cold November evening in 2023, an encounter with a homeless man outside a theater in Cleveland would reconnect Steve with that difficult period of his life in ways he never anticipated, forcing him to confront uncomfortable truths about success, compassion, and the thin line that separates those who make it from those who do not. What began as a chance meeting on a city street would evolve into a profound examination of gratitude, responsibility, and the obligations that come with having escaped circumstances that still trap millions of others. Before we explore this powerful story, if you value content about compassion and perspective, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more stories about the encounters that challenge our assumptions and deepen our understanding of the world around us. Steve had traveled to Cleveland for a speaking engagement at the State Theater, a historic venue in the Playhouse Square district, where he would deliver a motivational address to a sold-out audience of business leaders, community organizers, and young people seeking inspiration and guidance. Cleveland held special significance for Steve because it was where his career had truly begun, where he had won a local comedy competition in 1985 that gave him his first real opportunity to perform professionally. He had not forgotten his roots in the city, and he returned periodically to support local initiatives and to remind himself of where he had come from before fame and fortune had transformed his circumstances. The evening was unseasonably cold for early November, with temperatures dropping into the low 30s and a harsh wind blowing off Lake Erie that made the air feel even more bitter. Steve arrived at the theater 2 hours before his scheduled appearance, his usual practice of arriving early to center himself and review his material before addressing an audience. His security team escorted him from his vehicle toward the theater entrance, moving efficiently through the standard protocols that accompanied any public appearance by someone of his celebrity status. It was during this brief walk from car to door, a distance of perhaps 50 feet, that Steve encountered a man who would fundamentally alter his perspective on success, poverty, and personal responsibility. The man was seated on the sidewalk adjacent to the theater entrance, wrapped in layers of obviously inadequate clothing that did little to protect him from the cutting wind. His appearance suggested he was perhaps in his late 50s or early 60s, though the weathering effects of street life often made accurate age assessment impossible. A cardboard sign rested against his leg, the handwritten message requesting help but distinguished from typical panhandling signs by its unusual specificity. The sign read, "Comedian who never made it. Anything helps. God bless." The detail about being a comedian caught Steve's attention immediately, disrupting his usual practice of moving quickly past homeless individuals to avoid creating scenes that his security team would need to manage. Steve stopped walking, a decision that immediately created concern among his security personnel who preferred continuous movement through public spaces to minimize vulnerability and crowd interaction. He approached the man on the sidewalk, ignoring the subtle protests from his team, and knelt down to bring himself to eye level with someone who was seated while Steve stood. The action was deliberate, a physical manifestation of respect and equality that went beyond the typical interaction between a wealthy celebrity and a person experiencing homelessness. Steve asked the man's name, received the response, "Marcus, sir, Marcus Williams," and then asked the question that would open a conversation neither man would ever forget. He asked Marcus about his claim to be a comedian who never made it, wanting to understand whether this was a creative panhandling strategy or a genuine statement about a dream that had died somewhere along the difficult road toward professional success. Marcus Williams looked directly at Steve Harvey, recognition flickering across his face despite the years and the circumstances that separated their current realities. He said with a mixture of pride and resignation that he had indeed been a comedian, that he had performed at open mic nights and small clubs throughout the Midwest during the 1980s and early 1990s, and that he had once shared a bill with Steve himself at a club in Detroit in 1987. The specificity of the claim gave it credibility, and Steve searched his memory for recollection of that time period, that city, that venue. The late 1980s had been a blur of constant travel, sleeping in his car between gigs, performing at any venue that would give him stage time, slowly building the skills and the reputation that would eventually lead to his breakthrough. Steve asked Marcus what had happened, what circumstances had led from performing comedy in clubs to sitting on a Cleveland sidewalk nearly 40 years later requesting spare change from strangers. The answer that Marcus provided over the next 20 minutes would haunt Steve Harvey for months afterward, forcing him to reconsider his own success narrative and to confront uncomfortable questions about talent, luck, perseverance, and the role of factors beyond individual control in determining who succeeds and who falls through the cracks of an unforgiving entertainment industry. Marcus explained that he had pursued comedy with the same dedication that Steve had demonstrated, performing constantly, writing new material, studying the craft, and believing absolutely that persistence and talent would eventually lead to success. He had experienced moments of encouragement, performances where audiences responded enthusiastically, opportunities to open for more established comedians who offered praise and predictions of future success. But the breakthrough never came. The television appearance that might have launched a career never materialized. The manager who could have opened doors to better opportunities never signed him. The critical mass of industry attention that transforms a struggling performer into a working professional never coalesced around his efforts. The lack of success had created financial pressures that became increasingly difficult to manage. Marcus had supported himself through day jobs that allowed flexibility for evening performances, working as a warehouse supervisor, a taxi driver, a security guard. But as years passed without meaningful progress toward comedy success, the sustainability of that lifestyle deteriorated. Relationships suffered under the strain of financial instability and the emotional toll of constant rejection. Marcus's marriage ended in divorce. He developed a drinking problem as a way of managing the disappointment and depression that accompanied the slow death of his dream. The drinking cost him jobs, housing, relationships, and eventually his sobriety for extended periods. By the mid-1990s, Marcus had largely stopped performing comedy, the pain of pursuing something that brought only disappointment having finally exceeded his capacity to continue. He worked sporadic jobs, experienced periods of homelessness interspersed with temporary housing situations, and gradually descended into the chronic homelessness that had now characterized his life for over a decade. He still wrote jokes occasionally, still thought in comedic terms about the absurdities of life on the streets, but the dream of performing professionally had been extinguished by years of evidence that whatever combination of talent, luck, timing, and connections were required for success, he did not possess them in sufficient measure. Steve Harvey listened to this account with growing discomfort, recognizing uncomfortable parallels between Marcus's story and his own early career struggles. The decision to pursue comedy despite financial instability, the years of sleeping in vehicles and performing for little or no money, the strain on personal relationships, the moments of doubt when quitting seemed more rational than continuing. Steve had experienced all of these challenges during his own journey toward success. The primary difference between their trajectories was not obviously attributable to superior talent or greater dedication on Steve's part. The difference appeared to be luck, timing, the specific opportunities that had materialized for Steve and not for Marcus, the breaks that had gone one way rather than another in the chaotic and unpredictable process of building an entertainment career. This realization was profoundly unsettling for Steve, whose personal narrative and public messaging had always emphasized the role of hard work, faith, and persistence in achieving success. He had built a motivational speaking career partly on the foundation of his own story, presenting his journey from homelessness to success as evidence that anyone could overcome difficult circumstances through determination and effort. But Marcus Williams represented a challenge to that narrative, an example of someone who had demonstrated determination and effort yet had not achieved success, who had pursued the same dream through the same difficult circumstances, but whose story had ended in chronic homelessness rather than national fame and multi-million-dollar contracts. Steve made a decision in that moment that reflected both compassion and a need to understand more deeply what had differentiated their paths. He invited Marcus to join him inside the theater, to get out of the cold, and to continue their conversation in a more comfortable environment. His security team was clearly uncomfortable with this decision, but Steve overruled their concerns and personally escorted Marcus through the theater entrance and into a private room away from the gathering audience. He asked his assistant to arrange for food and coffee, and he spent the next 90 minutes in conversation with Marcus Williams about comedy, poverty, addiction, mental health, the entertainment industry, and the complex factors that determine success and failure in creative pursuits. Marcus shared details about his comedy career that demonstrated genuine talent and understanding of the craft. He described his comedic style, his influences, his approach to writing material. He recounted specific performances, audience reactions, moments when he had felt certain that he was on the verge of breakthrough success. Steve recognized in these descriptions the authentic experience of a working comedian, the insights and observations that could only come from someone who had genuinely pursued the art form seriously rather than dabbling casually. Marcus Williams had been a real comedian, not merely someone who had tried comedy a few times before moving on to other pursuits. The dream had been genuine, the dedication had been real, and the failure had been devastating precisely because it represented the death of something that had mattered profoundly. The conversation also explored the role of addiction and mental health in Marcus's descent into chronic homelessness. He acknowledged that his drinking had been both a response to disappointment and a contributing factor to his inability to recover from setbacks. He described periods of depression that made basic functioning difficult, let alone the sustained effort required to rebuild a life after significant losses. He discussed the way that homelessness itself created barriers to recovery, the difficulty of maintaining sobriety without stable housing, the challenge of finding employment without a permanent address, the psychological toll of social invisibility, and daily humiliation that made self-improvement seem impossible. Steve asked difficult questions about choices Marcus had made, decisions that might have altered his trajectory if handled differently. Marcus answered with honesty about mistakes and poor judgment, acknowledging responsibility for his circumstances, while also noting the structural factors that made recovery from those mistakes nearly impossible given the limited resources available to him. The conversation was remarkable for its depth and mutual respect. Two men who had started from similar circumstances but had ended up in radically different places attempting to understand the forces that had shaped their divergent paths. As their conversation approached the time when Steve needed to prepare for his speaking engagement, he asked Marcus what he needed, what assistance would be most helpful in his current situation. Marcus's response was both modest and revealing. He did not request large sums of money or permanent solutions to his circumstances. He asked for help getting into a rehabilitation program that could address his drinking, assistance finding temporary housing that might allow him to stabilize enough to seek employment, and perhaps most poignantly, he asked if Steve remembered any of his jokes from that night in Detroit in 1987 when they had shared a bill. The request to be remembered as a comedian rather than as a homeless person, to have his identity as an artist acknowledged even in failure, was deeply moving to Steve. Steve committed to helping Marcus access addiction treatment and housing services, providing financial resources, and connecting him with organizations in Cleveland that worked with homeless individuals. But he also did something more personally significant. He asked Marcus to tell him some of his jokes, to perform material right there in the private room before Steve went on stage to deliver his motivational address to an audience of successful people who had paid substantial amounts to hear his wisdom about achieving success. Marcus, self-conscious about his appearance and his circumstances, initially declined, but Steve insisted, explaining that he genuinely wanted to hear the comedy of someone who had loved the art form enough to sacrifice everything in pursuit of it. Marcus Williams performed 5 minutes of material, jokes he had written decades earlier and preserved in memory through years of homelessness and addiction. The jokes were good, genuinely funny observations delivered with timing and skill that reflected serious study of the craft. Steve laughed authentically, not out of pity or obligation, but because the material was legitimately amusing and skillfully executed. When Marcus finished, there was a moment of silence before Steve said something that Marcus would later describe as the most meaningful thing anyone had said to him in over 20 years. Steve told him that he was funny, that his material was good, that he had been a real comedian regardless of whether fame and fortune had followed, and that his dedication to the art form deserved respect even though the industry had not rewarded it. Steve then went on stage and delivered his scheduled motivational address, but his message had been fundamentally altered by his conversation with Marcus Williams. Rather than delivering his standard presentation about the power of persistence and the inevitability of success for those who work hard enough, Steve spoke honestly about luck, privilege, timing, and the role of factors beyond individual control in determining outcomes. He acknowledged that his own success owed as much to fortunate circumstances as to talent and effort, that there were people equally talented and hardworking who had not succeeded, and that society had an obligation to provide support and dignity to those whose dreams had not materialized regardless of how hard they had worked to achieve them. The audience responded with surprising appreciation to this more nuanced and humble message. Many approached Steve afterward to share their own experiences of near failure, of recognizing how narrowly they had avoided circumstances like Marcus's, of feeling uncomfortable with success narratives that ignored the role of luck and privilege. Several attendees asked specifically about Marcus, wanting to contribute to his rehabilitation and housing efforts, and by the end of the evening Steve had collected commitments totaling over $50,000, specifically designated for comprehensive services for Marcus Williams, and for expansion of programs serving homeless individuals in Cleveland. Steve maintained contact with Marcus throughout the subsequent months, checking on his progress through treatment, celebrating milestones of sobriety, supporting his transition into stable housing and eventually into part-time employment with a community organization that provided services to homeless individuals. Marcus remained sober, maintained his housing, and slowly rebuilt a life that had stability and dignity, even if it did not include the comedy career he had once dreamed of achieving. He began facilitating support groups for other formerly homeless individuals struggling with addiction, drawing on his own experiences to provide credible guidance and empathy to people facing similar challenges. The encounter with Marcus Williams had lasting impacts on Steve Harvey's perspective and his work. He became a more vocal advocate for homeless services, addiction treatment, and mental health support, speaking publicly about the need for comprehensive social safety nets that provided genuine pathways out of poverty rather than merely managing its symptoms. He incorporated more nuance into his motivational messaging, acknowledging the role of luck and circumstance in success while still affirming the importance of effort and persistence. He established a foundation program specifically focused on supporting artists and performers who had dedicated their lives to creative pursuits but had not achieved commercial success, recognizing that the value of art extended beyond market validation. 2 years after their initial encounter, Steve invited Marcus to appear on his television talk show to share his story of recovery and to perform comedy for a national audience for the first time in over 30 years. Marcus delivered a 5-minute set about homelessness, addiction, and second chances, material that was both funny and deeply moving, demonstrating the skill and perspective that came from lived experience combined with genuine comedic talent. The performance was not a launching pad for a late-career comedy success, but it was validation of Marcus's identity as a comedian, acknowledgement that his years of dedication to the craft had not been wasted even though they had not led to commercial success. In conversations afterward, Marcus told Steve that the most valuable gift he had received was not the financial assistance or the housing or even the sobriety support, though all of those had been essential to his recovery. The most valuable gift had been Steve's willingness to see him as a comedian rather than merely as a homeless person, to recognize his identity as an artist even in circumstances that suggested total failure, and to validate that pursuing a dream was worthwhile even when that dream did not materialize in the ways originally envisioned. Being remembered as someone who had loved comedy enough to sacrifice everything for it, even when that sacrifice had led to homelessness rather than success, gave meaning to years that might otherwise have seemed like complete waste. Steve Harvey reflected publicly on how Marcus Williams had changed his perspective on success, failure, and the responsibilities of those who achieved wealth and fame. He acknowledged that encountering someone whose story so closely paralleled his own early struggles, but whose outcome had been so different, forced him to recognize how much of his success had been attributable to factors beyond his control. He spoke about the importance of humility, of recognizing that achievement did not necessarily reflect superior character or greater effort, and of the obligation to support those who had worked equally hard but whose circumstances had led to different outcomes. As we conclude this profound story, it is worth reflecting on what Steve Harvey's encounter with Marcus Williams teaches us about success, compassion, and our obligations to others. Steve could have walked past Marcus without stopping, could have offered money without conversation, could have treated the encounter as a brief charitable gesture before moving on to his scheduled engagement. Instead, he chose to invest time in genuine conversation, to confront uncomfortable questions about the randomness of success and failure, and to develop an ongoing relationship that challenged his own narratives and deepened his understanding of the world. If this story resonated with you, if it reminded you that our common humanity transcends differences in circumstances and that those who have achieved success bear responsibility for supporting those who have not, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more content about the encounters that deepen our compassion and broaden our perspective. The homeless man with a cardboard sign outside a Cleveland theater was not merely a person in need of charity. He was Marcus Williams, a comedian who had pursued his dream with dedication and sacrifice, whose talent had been genuine even though industry success had never materialized, and whose story paralleled Steve Harvey's own journey in ways that made their divergent outcomes a matter of luck and circumstance rather than character or effort. Recognizing that truth, uncomfortable as it was, allowed Steve to approach Marcus with genuine respect rather than pity, to see in him not a cautionary tale about insufficient persistence, but rather a reminder that success is never purely a product of individual merit, and that those who achieve it have obligations to those whose equally sincere efforts led to different outcomes. The encounter lasted only hours, but its impacts extended across years, changing how Steve thought about his own success, how he approached his work as a motivational speaker, and how he understood his responsibilities to use his platform and resources to support those whom the entertainment industry and society more broadly had left behind.